You all right, Colin?
Hi,
How's it
Harry.
going?
Yeah, good to meet you.
And you, mate, yeah. Whereabouts are you?
Um, Somewhere in the woods in Scotland, in a cabin.
Yeah, looks
Um,
cool.
yeah, so I've got a bit of a writing, recording space. So yeah,
Ah,
um,
nice.
yeah. What about you?
I'm in Manchester these days, yeah.
All right, cool.
You coming
Good,
here
good.
in later in the year, is that right?
I am. Yeah, September I'll be coming through. Yeah, I always love going to Manchester, playing there.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so you do this podcast. So I've been looking a little online and getting a sense of what you do. So it's kind of looking at that sort of well, you tell me. I had a look
Yeah.
and I've been prompted.
Yeah, yeah, just looking at back at that the era of music really, especially in the UK, in the 2000s. And it's interesting, like obviously doing my research about your career and I feel like you were a little older when it came into the early 2000s. Were you? So it's interesting to get your take. Like, did you feel there was something different happening at that point?
Um, yeah, I think there was something. Um, I suppose when you're on trying to, you know, get your music going, or you hopefully get into that kind of cusp of getting it going, then it always feels for anyone that era is quite important or quite kind of resonates with you. So yeah, it seemed like there was a lot of kind of exciting music and a bit of a kind of shifting sort of trend, with kind of the more guitar orientated music. I was really into, leading up to that period of the sort of turn of the millennium, OK Computer, um, things like Mercury Rev, Deserter Songs, Flaming Lips, Wu-Tang Clan, Belle and Sebastian. Um, so I suppose for me it was a kind of mix of those influences, and you hope to then find your own authentic, thing out of that. But yeah, I think it did feel like I was in Glasgow, so I'm from the Isle of Mull, from the Hebrides, but by that kind of late 90s, I was in Glasgow and trying to get my music going. I kind of got Mull Historical Society start, I kind of got it started in Glasgow, really. Um, and so I was quite keen to try and infiltrate that sort of Glasgow scene and there was a great football booking where there was sort of Snow Patrol, Teenage Fan Club, Belle and Sebastian, um, yeah, a lot of these kind of bands, and I was always kind of, even though it sounds like, Mull Historical Society is a kind of sounds like a collective. Well, the audience are the society really, but I was always kind of on my own, so I was new to a city, came from a small, 2,000 people on the island I grew up in. So it was quite a big rush of change, and it was good to try and find where the music scene was happening, So that's my kind of experience of that period in Glasgow, and then going to London quite a bit to try and play at various A&R scout sort of nights and stuff, So but yeah, I think I signed with Rough Trade and then Warner's, and so definitely um, found myself in amongst that period and touring with quite a lot of people of that period and getting to know a lot of those bands. I always felt a bit like an outsider, but I feel like, yeah, you're right. Maybe, I wasn't 18, when I got signed. So there seems to, you look back retrospectively, there seems to be a kind of impression that I almost arrived fully formed. Now I know that, there was years of trying to make that happen and going right back to Mull. My uncles were the plumbers on the island, still are, and they were the covers band that I first got into, and they played Beatles, Stones, Dylan, you know, um, the Kinks, loads of that stuff, and this was in the kind of late 80s, early 90s, but I suppose with Britpop and all that stuff, all that was coming back again, just when I was kind of trying to get my own music out there.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's interesting. Like, it's reading that you're in bands from an early age, basically. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, growing up in Mull, there was no record shop. With the I grew up in Tobermory, which some people might know it as Balamory of a certain age. Um,
Right.
the,
Okay. Yeah.
the kids show, the coloured houses, and so that's based on the town of Mull I grew up on. So maybe 800 people in the town. So it's the biggest place on the island. Definitely come from the metropolis on Mull, but relatively small based, comparatively speaking, with the mainland. So yeah, there was none of those conventional things. I didn't grow up in Camden or Manhattan, Bristol, Glasgow, Manchester for that matter, but I grew up in a place where I was lucky that my grandfather on one side of my family was the island's bank manager, but he was a poet, published poet all his life. So he was known as the Bard of Mull. So so I had writing around me and writers in my family, but the other side of my family were the island's plumbers. And they were all amateur musicians. So they were the people, as mentioned, had a covers band. And so I mean, there wasn't even, excuse me, there wasn't even a fantastic radio signal then. It's much better now with digital. But so there wasn't, I was lucky that I had that going on in my doorstep. There was no cinema, nothing like that. But I had this live band of my uncles rehearsing in their plumber's garage just across the town from me every Tuesday, every Thursday. And quite often at the weekend, they'd play somewhere on the island. So from about 6, 7 years old, I just was infatuated with them. They were quite hairy, Hebridean plumbers, and they played all these amazing songs. And I think I was about, I don't know, 9 or 10 when Live Aid happened. And I realized that these songs my uncles were playing were actually by Bob Dylan and Dire Straits and Neil Young and the Stones, and so um, so it was I suppose everyone's upbringing is unique to them, isn't it? But I suppose I did grow up somewhere um, that was maybe on the edges a bit, and strangely, by the time I had loads of bands as a kid, and even when I remember when my music started to happen, and I remember doing these interviews with Q and Rolling Stone, and I used to love throwing in, they'd ask you who was my influences, and I used to love saying the Wave Band, that's my uncle's covers band, and they'd all be like these esteemed critics, kind of thinking, what, oh, have we missed this, because my uncles never wrote their own songs, but I was just around that all the time, and by the time I was about, I don't know, maybe 11, 12, I had my own covers band called Tracks. The X was really important in that, and started playing in the same town hall that they played in. And then, yeah, I went off to Glasgow to study, and really thinking it would be a good way to infiltrate the Glasgow music scene. If I'm a student, I'll be around bands, and it was all kind of because of that. And I went back home one of those summers, back home for the summer to Mull, and I saw in the local hall that I'd grown up playing in, that I'm going back to play in actually in June, back home as part of the UK tour. It's called the Aris Hall, where my uncles played in. I noticed in the window there was a poster for the Mull Historical Society having an AGM, like an annual general meeting. And I'd never heard of this. I thought, what's this? And I was studying 1984 in my course, Orwell. So I think I just joined those two things together, and I suddenly thought, I'd noticed that summer that you couldn't do things. I mean, there was no practice swings on the golf course. There was no dumping on the main street. I mean, I think they meant dumping of, waste, but there was not. I suddenly thought, why can't you do all these things? I've been away at uni, and I think I wrote a song imagining the Mull Historical Society with this kind of Orwellian organization running the island. They weren't, but and um, and that song, I'd had several bands in Glasgow by then, and as I said, I was starting to get to know some other bands. But that song, something shifted. All those things that I was into, like Mercury Rev, as I said, even yeah, loads of hip hop, television, Blur, Oasis, all these things that I'd been soaking up. Pulp was probably a big one for me, actually. Pulp was a band that I really thought were quite original. They weren't kind of regurgitating the 60s. I thought Pulp were quite interesting. I'm not, Damon Albarn is a phenomenal songwriter as well. So there was lots of real influencers for me. But there was something about that song, Mull Historical Society, and maybe just the name of it. I don't know. It became, I finally kind of got a single. I thought, okay, and I got management who were based in London who'd kind of got interested in me over that period. And they said, okay, we're putting this out. What are you going to call yourself? Because my demos were just going out under my name, Colin MacIntyre. I was like, oh, well, I'll just call myself Mull Historical Society. And that song, towards the end of 2000, November 7th or something like that, 2000, it came out. And my manager called me, and I was in Glasgow at uni, and my manager said, are you sitting down? Actually, I was walking my grandmother, who's from Mull, but was down visiting us in Glasgow, out of a coffee shop. And I said, well, I've got my gran on my arm, so I can't really sit down. But he goes, well, can I swear on this? Is that okay? I don't know if you're allowed to
Yeah,
swear.
of course.
It
Yeah, yeah.
doesn't matter. I mean, and he said, well, the NME have just picked your song as their debut single of the year. And this was the end of the year. So it was quite nice that there was a lot of the year passed, but they were giving it to me then. And I went, fucking hell. And he went, you can't swear in front of your gran. And I goes, I can. She doesn't mind. And Rough Trade, Jeff Travis, who signed the Smiths and obviously then the Strokes and so many bands, obviously. I should say in the months preceding that, in 2000, he'd come up to Glasgow and seen me perform, and I kind of thought, oh God, this is going to happen. I think there was a few near misses, and the day before I went down to do NME TV, which was a bit ahead of its time, really. You think about end of 2000, there was a kind of TV part of NME, and Jeff had been up to see me perform in Glasgow. King Tut's Nice and Sleazy is one of those two in Glasgow. And I was on the same flight as him going back down to go to do this NME promo. First bit of proper promo, I mean, I'd been around a few years and trying to get things going to London, whatever, but first single out and proper. And the single was called Barcode Bypass, double A with the song Mull Historical Society. And Jeff, sitting at Glasgow Airport, having had quite a night the night before, thinking, I think this is a record deal happening, You can imagine the state I was in, really. Said, okay, I want you to sign with me. I've got a deal with Warner's as well. We could go from Rough Trade to Warner's. And I was like, wow, okay. And he played me a song by a New York band, and he said, they're going to be huge. Nobody's really heard of them yet, and they're going to be playing the UK in 6 months' time, summer 2001. He goes, we'd like to have had a few singles by you by then, hopefully building you up. I'd like you to tour with them. And I can still remember this conversation, bleary-eyed, 8 a.m. Glasgow Airport. And we went down on the flight, and it was the Strokes. And I remember listening to them. It was the modern age, and listening to it and thinking, it sounded a bit like Lou Reed, a bit like Television, a bit like lots of, but I liked it. And true to his word, all that happened.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So that's it's quite hard, Harry, to put in a nutshell why things happen, but that was the kind of origins, I suppose, and then coming up with a name, and then somehow finding a sound that felt authentic to me, but and getting to go into a studio, because I've got hundreds of my demos by this point on 4-track, all a bit compressed to a drum machine, and wasn't quite sounding as wide as I wanted it. And I finally, with all the interest I got around that late 2000 period, I had all these publishers giving me money to go and make demos, and it was great because I was sort of halfway through recording what became Lost, my debut album, with all these different people interested in me, and it kind of culminated with Jeff and a fellow called Russell Warby, who some of your listeners might know. I don't know if he's quite a kind of legend in the music industry, but Russell was Nirvana's booking agent. Foo Fighters also became the Strokes agent. But Russell had come up to King Tut's to see me play just around then and said, "Look, I want you to sign with me." And then I also signed with the same label and publisher as the Strokes, as well as agent. So it wasn't all Strokes, but I just mean I felt in good company, and then suddenly the beginning of 2001, more singles coming out, leading all the time I'm on the road, but sort of chipping away at my debut album. And I had my first proper UK tour was Support and Elbow, who strangely have Mull connections. The brothers, are the twins? I'm not sure, brothers in the band. Their parents had retired to Mull.
All right.
From your area, Manchester obviously been Elbow. So, and they were lovely and we got on well. And so all kind of just started to snowball around that period, and but I think there was something about making those studio recordings that just seemed to, and producing it myself, I felt like it started to sound the way I heard it in my head, and I think that's probably what made things start to go in the right direction for me.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the production because I saw, like you say, you produced the first album yourself. But you're saying like you were recording that before you got the record deal, really?
Yeah,
or alongside it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I probably had, almost about every music publisher. I mean, if you imagine, Harry, I'd been trying for 2 or 3 years in Glasgow. I'd had different bands that I'd had interest, I'd come, do showcase, but I was probably chasing the interest more than it was chasing me, but I was dogged, I was, I didn't, as I said, where I came from, there was no A&R people on Mull, unless they were sailing by or something on their holidays, Um, I did subsequently meet Bernard Sumner for New Order, around that time at a publishing do, and he told me he often sailed by Mull actually. So there was some people, but it would have been quite a coincidence for him to have heard me rehearsing and be interested, So yeah, there was a period there where suddenly that kind of late, that 99 period, and as I said, starting to write these songs that suddenly felt, oh, they feel like me. It felt like, obviously I was influenced by things, but and I would go to all the Glasgow venues like King Tut's Wah Wah Hut, which I'm sure you've heard of, and where Oasis were signed, and Nice and Sleazy's, and I'd go and see bands, this is sort of late 90s, like Coldplay, saw them in King Tut's to about, they must have been playing to about 80 people. I remember I'm playing this song, is it Shiver? Was that the first kind of hit, I think? Yeah, I remember him, big mound of curly hair. And and he was obviously very new, and I was even newer, I was in the audience, but I was kind of getting close to getting some interest, I was sort of, and they were co-headlining with a band called Terrace from Wales, who ended up on the front cover of the NME very early. They were also on Rough Trade and Warner's, so I ended up touring with them within about a year. But at that point, they were almost the hot thing more than Coldplay, on this tour. And I remember Chris Martin on stage saying, this is number 37 in the charts. So it was Shiver, and he was really excited, and everybody cheered. And then he said, and this next one's the next single, and it was called Yellow. And I remember I remember, I mean, it sounds like hindsight, but I remember being in the audience and thinking, it's so clear, the sound. It sounded, you could almost hear it in a stadium, it felt like it was. Um, so I was soaking up a lot of that, as I said, yeah, kind of getting to start properly studio demo my own music. And I mean, I just naturally produced my first album, Loss, and the first three actually. And because since I was a kid back in Mull in my bedroom, I just weekends would pass in a flash because I'd go in on a Friday afternoon after school with my 4 track and record. I didn't really know I was producing, but yeah, I was playing all the instruments, I was recording, and then by the Sunday night I'd have another 5 songs, and I've still got them in a thing here. I've got about 300 songs that were recorded even before I got close to a record deal, and most of them should never be heard by anybody. But I still tap into, there's still even mates because, my mates were playing, were all part of this. They were kind of, all my songs were just documenting what I was up to, what I was, and, you know, even now, some of them will say to me all these later, what about that song? And it might be something, there's still a title there's my 10th MHS album, my new album, In My Mind's a Photograph, there's actually a song which is something that was a melody in my head probably when I was a teenager, and it's just sometimes something feels right. And you wouldn't maybe take the whole thing, but there might just be one element that you know what to do with now. So anyway, yeah, there was that period that was very exciting and gradually started to kind of support bands that were touring through Glasgow. Do you know what I mean? And as I said, then the Rough Trade and NME, and I was in King Tut's supporting, I think, a band called Low Gold. Low Gold? I don't know. I
Okay.
can't remember. I don't know what label they're on. Maybe Nude, who are Suede. Uh, Sorry to be talking about the label so much, but I suppose
No, it's interesting.
I'm putting it in a sort of context that way.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and um, I remember, this is me just supporting, being the local support, but there was already a little buzz in Glasgow about Mull Historical, and things were starting to. I had this, as I said, this kind of quite big London management, so things were starting to. And I remember the guy who run the venue came, and they ran Tea in the Park and that big festival, so there's quite a hub there, and he came running in and he said, Joe Wiley's playing you on Radio 1. He's playing, and my first single was the double A side, and Barcode Bypass was 7.5 minutes long. About a shopkeeper trying to tell his wife he's going to have a heart attack. It wasn't your standard first single length or subject matter, but something about that song connected, maybe even more than the Mull Historical song. There was something about the slow, long song that really seemed to connect, and that was the one they gave the NME had given Single of the Year. And this was prime time Radio 1 afternoon, and I was like, what? And all those things just started to. I'm saying this for anyone who's currently trying to get their career going or whatever, because there was something there that culminated, and you make a bit of luck as well, hopefully. But there was that was the kind of period that then a lot of those bands that had been the sort of Britpop era, just maybe ahead of me, suddenly you were finding yourself kind of in that environment, really, and it was so exciting, just to kind of be a part of it.
Yeah, yeah. No, I was enjoying that song today. That was one that stood out to me from the first album, really.
Oh, really? No, it's
Yeah, yeah.
funny. It seems to. I remember writing it, and I remember just going into the kind of first person of being this shopkeeper, and I was hugely into things like the League of Gentlemen series and things, kind of quite dark, quirky, and so for me, the character it was really one of the first times I was writing about characters, but the reviews were talking about a comment on globalization and stuff because it was about a small shop getting overtaken by the new 24-hour stores that was happening, so it might all seem very not obvious now, but we live in that kind of culture now. But then And I remember going back home suddenly, time out, London, like NME coming to Mull, wanting to go to Mull, and they were all looking at the corner shop in Todmorey Main Street, and say, "Oh, is that the shop?" And it wasn't really about home. I'd probably written it more about, being in Glasgow because that's where I was then. But there was something about that song that did change kind of everything for me. It's quite hard to pick one moment, but actually, I think without that song, I don't think I'd be sitting talking to you now.
Yeah, fair play. And being on Rough Trade, did they give you the freedom in terms of letting you record how you want to record, kind of thing?
Oh, totally. Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, I was I was like a kid in a sweetie shop, because the studio in Glasgow, um, anyone Scottish listening or of Glasgow origin, or there's a complex called Berkeley that is just the best place in Glasgow for rehearsal. And, even touring bands, huge bands coming through Glasgow had to rehearse, would go to Berkeley, but also all the local bands. It was run by a complete legend, Steve Shane, for many years, who not long ago sadly passed away, but Steve left such a legacy. And that's where I kind of hung out, rehearsed, but also through that and football, as I said earlier, got to kind of know some of the bands of the, like Snow Patrol were kicking around, all these kind of bands. But I was really lucky that Steve's mate had started his own studio next in Berkeley in the complex, and he'd been in loads of 80s bands, quite successful touring and stuff. But he literally was wiring it in, and Steve had said, "Look, Brian's sitting up next door, my mate, go in and have a look." And he was literally wiring the studio together. And I went in, and I kid you not, it was just at the time when there was a bit of interest, as I mentioned, so I was getting a bit of demo money. I probably spent the next 3 years of my life in that room making my next two albums. And I didn't just record, 10, 11, 12 songs for the album. I was recording about 40 songs at a time. And suddenly, if I heard a harp in my head, I would call the Glasgow, you know, School of Music, and a harp player would turn up. So suddenly I really was like a kid in a sweet shop. And Rough Trade, I then morphed onto a label called Blanco and Negro, which was Rough Trade's deal with Warner's. So you kind of had Jeff and Rough Trade and that real authentic A&R and, good ears and long-standing history there, but you also had a major label, so I suddenly had a 6 album deal with Warner's. I think I made 3 of those, but I didn't, I've made the albums elsewhere. But yeah, you're right. It was the production and making the songs how I heard them, and having that kind of hub, that base. Um, it was, yeah, it was just magical, really. I mean, but I was so focused. I mean, I almost look back in it when my first single hit the charts. So my Chris Martin moment I talked about when I saw him. My first single was that hit the charts was a song called "Watching Xanadu," and it got to number 32 or something like that. The Sunday, as it used to be when the charts came out, I was in Berkeley in the recording place, recording my second album, and the engineer was like, "What are you doing? You're in the charts. I mean, go and celebrate," And so we did all I just downed tools, and we all went out and got suitably celebrated, and um, so, but I look back on that and I think I was so sort of driven and focused, you know what I mean? And I think because I was, I wasn't a band, I was doing, I was playing a lot of it myself. I was writing all myself. I had a lot of good musicians around me, don't get me wrong, and a really good touring band. But I think I just was trying to I felt I'm getting my chance finally. Do you know what I mean? And it's happening. And I just wanted to kind of uh, really just get as much out of me as I could.
Yeah, yeah. make hay, etc.
Exactly, yeah, and that's kind of just 10 albums, 25 years later. That's continued, really, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's get stuck into the Strokes stuff then.
Yeah.
So, like, how many gigs did you play with him on that tour?
Um, God, I don't know exactly. I mean, I think we did about a month, and then Fabio, the drummer, Fab broke his hand. I
Was
don't know
that
if you
in
know it.
Scotland? It was in Scotland, wasn't
Yes,
it?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I don't know if you know these kind of stories, but um, yeah, he broke his hand outside a club in Glasgow, and we went. I think it was like a Monday night we played King Tut's. Monday or Tuesday night. I don't know how I remember that. I'm going back to do a tour, 25 years almost to the day, and I'm doing Tuts actually because I'm doing a kind of music and book tour in June. Um, but so it wasn't really a club night, and I remember we went to this club and really it was empty, and they were really nice guys, they were nice people, and he was a real sweet guy. Um, but there was some sort of altercation. I think he was something went a bit wrong, and he was upset, and so that happened, and then um, suddenly the next night, wherever we were going, was the whole tour was put on pause, and I think it was probably because we played Edinburgh, then Glasgow, Edinburgh the night before Glasgow, and I think we definitely got them drinking loads of whiskey, and so maybe there was that had something to do with it, and it was such an exciting night. I've met so many people over the years who will say they were at that King Tut's Strokes show, and it was with MHS, Mouldy Peaches, and the Strokes. And the Mouldy Peaches shared our tour bus. And Ad, and Kimya, they kind of dressed as animals. So we had these two sort of furry animals on our bus. Um, and he dressed as Robin Hood, I think. Is that right? Yeah. And the tour started. So if I back up a little bit from when it was put on ice, when this incident happened.
So what happened? Was it in a takeaway or something? I heard him say or something, or was it in the club where he broke his hand?
Yeah, and it just coming out of the pub.
Right, right, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I was standing right there with them. Yeah, I mean,
Oh,
I
right.
saw what
Well, it's some
happened.
kind
Yeah.
of altercation. I don't know.
I not hitting anybody else in that. I think he sort of hit a bin.
Out frustration.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, out of frustration. There was something that happened. It was nothing to do with them. I think it was there was people with us because we were obviously based in Glasgow. So I think sometimes just something there was something with the bouncer or somebody had said, I don't know what it was, and but it was nothing on their character at all. It was just and but that's what happened, and
Yeah.
it was probably they were all over the music press. I mean, they were the hottest band in the world. Um, so for this tour to suddenly come to a halt, so what happened was their merch guy, God, what was his name? Another lovely guy. He was a drummer and obviously knew their set, and their set was really only 35. It was just the first album. It was all quite short,
Yeah.
and so he stepped in, but there was a few days where the tour was on hold and we didn't know what was happening. So we went to North Wales and in the tour bus and had a really nice sort of couple of days because it was June, it was nice weather, and we ended up playing football and these sort of and just having barbecues. Mouldy Peaches with us. Don't know if they'd
Yes.
ever kicked a football, but they got involved, and we were just waiting to find out what was happening. And then we did more dates with the replacement drummer, and then we. So when you said how long was it, I can't quite remember because then by the time they were all well again, Fab was back. At the end of that summer, we picked up a few of the shows. I think
Okay.
Liverpool, Sheffield, and by which point I, as MHS plus them had played their first summer, festival. So I remember arriving at like Leeds, Reading, you know, it was exciting for me, but because of the Strokes profile, they were kind of getting moved up the bill everywhere. You know, it was almost like everyone was playing catch up, you know, and they were suddenly on the main stages. And um, we got to like Tea in the Park. Everywhere we went, we were just on the same stop off. This was in the kind of after we'd done the tour, but then the makeup dates were done, you know, after this. So it was quite nice to have that coming together again after the summer. I remember Tea in the Park. Somebody reminded me just recently of this. Nick Valenci was really nervous about the show because they were kind of getting catapulted onto main stages, you know. And he I think it was a really good thing for him to take his mind off it a bit. He was my guitar tech. So
Right.
I remember, I mean, you know, you forget things, you know, but I remember he came on stage with my guitar and I kind of gave him a, this is Nick from the Strokes, and everyone such a, um, but yeah, but back to the beginning of it, the first night was in Brighton and it just gathered steam, you know, it just, and they arrived in a blue transit van. As I said earlier, I already had done a few tours and had a tour bus, and I can still remember them running on the bus and looking at the bunks, and they were just like wide-eyed, you know, and they within about 2 or 3 nights they had a tour bus, and it was funny. It started right on the south coast, and then it went all over the UK. As I said, a bit of a Scottish post-Scotland interruption, um, and then we finished. It went all round. We got. I remember Oxford. It came back down England, and we finished at Heaven in London. And by then, you know, if they weren't on all the front pages already, by then they were just. It was like electric, you know. And it was such a privilege um, watching them every night. And I remember that night in Glasgow. I don't know. We were all, you know, all had a few drinks, and we're sort of running along Sucky Hall Street in Glasgow, where Nice and Sleazy's is, where I Jeff and all the, you know, rough trade. So things were all changing really quickly. But um, I remember starting to sing last night to them, and we were sort of falling in amongst, you know, like rubbish bin. You know, we were just having a laugh, you know. And they started singing "I Tried," which was my single at the time to me. So it was just a really, I think it was just a really sort of special time. And then, but I remember we got to Oxford, and I signed my publishing deal that night on the back, the paper, but on the back of one of my mates who'd sort of come on tour with me. And you know, they were there for that as well, and they'd signed, as I said, with the same publisher. And I remember there was like Kate Moss there, and um, I always remember Oxford because obviously I was on before them, and we were side of stage at the Oxford Zodiac. And I mentioned earlier, I don't think I would have found my sound without Radiohead and OK Computer and just things like that. And I was at Oxford. It was, you know, it was probably, I think it was the night before London, so it was kind of towards the end of the tour, and it was just buzzy where you went, you know, sold out. It was hot tickets, I suppose. I mean, I was just in the middle of it all. You know, I'm looking back now and realizing it was quite a moment, but it was just all, a lot was happening for me as well, you know, but obviously for them, it was all on a huge level. And side of stage in Oxford, and I remember the dressing room door opening from the outside, or it was like a fire escape, and these guys all come in, and one of them sort of was smaller, and he kind of caught me in the eye and sort of just did a bit of a sort of smile at me, and it was Radiohead. And I remember thinking, God, if I wasn't nervous enough, you know. And so it was quite exciting to know you were going to walk on the stage, you know, that they were there. And then yeah, it just, there was something about every night. It was just great to perform, but then to watch them as well, and just it was so exciting. And to be honest, I love Is This It? You know, I love the sound of it, but I think it was even more exciting live. You know, it was more edgy, definitely more edgy. You know, um, but it was very exciting, and I felt creatively, I just felt I was in the right place, and it was happening, and you were getting to meet a lot of people. I remember having this conversation with Neil Tennant, the Pet Shop Boys, at Heaven at the London club, and um, it was just fun, sort of starting to get to meet some of the people who you really respected as well.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting reading about that gig now. Like people like the Libertines were there.
Yeah, yeah, I've met quite a lot of people. Do you know, I'm making a radio program on islands at the moment, another ball in the air at the moment, but I've been interviewing different people from 5 different islands, like um, Mull, but also Isle of Wight, looking at the different music scenes. One of them is Eel Pie Island. I don't know if you've heard of Eel Pie, but it's on
Yeah,
the
because of
Thames.
Mystery Jets. Yeah.
I'm just about to say, yeah. So one of them, so I went to meet the Mystery Jets and talked to them. But obviously, Eel Pie was famous in the '60s for the Stones and Bowie as when he was David Jones and all that history. Um, and Blaine was telling me that he was about 17 or something at one of the shows. So met the Libertines obviously through Rough Trade, and um, I think what happened subsequently with Arctic Monkeys, Franz Ferdinand, a lot of these bands that maybe the Strokes were quite a moment for what came next. And of course we didn't know that at the time, but it doesn't surprise me a lot of these people were at those shows. And also I remember actually one of my first MHS shows in London to the kind of music industry, if you like. I mean, I knew I was going the Rough Trade route, but I did do this showcase, and it was just having spent many years trying to get people to come to your gigs. I mean, I must have gone to London with 15 record company people on my guest list at one point. This is before MHS. None of them turned up. But if you can imagine, about 18 months later, suddenly the music industry is in the room, and it wasn't just me. I was sharing a bill with Ed Harcourt. I
Oh,
remember.
another name. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it was an NME sort of showcase night. Again, it was all about that time and probably lucky having the NME behind you and stuff. And I remember I had the shipping forecast, coming from Mull and stuff. I had the shipping forecast as my entry music. And
That's nice. Yeah.
and I remember, and I used it on my second album, Us actually. But I remember the door opening of the dressing room and Jarvis Cocker walked in. Now, I'd explained earlier, probably Pulp were my favorite sort of band of that period, or leading up to that, for me. I thought there was something really original about them and still something quite timeless about their music, even now, it's, and, and he goes, "Oh, I love the shipping forecast." He's like, "I really love the show." And I don't know what he said about the gig, but he loved the shipping forecast. And he was managed by Rough Trade. So the day I signed my record deal, I had Jarvis Cocker and Keris Matthews sitting there, who just happened to be visiting Rough Trade, nothing to do with me, but it was quite a nice moment. So, but yeah, back to yeah, there was definitely quite a lot of people coming to these shows. Obviously, people who I respected and knew, but it turns out bands who were, not discovered yet, but must have been influenced by what the Strokes were doing.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's pretty amazing. I mean, obviously, you were doing well in your own right, but to have like a front row seat for that kind of thing, or even a backstage seat for that kind of thing, must be pretty amazing to look back on.
Yeah, yeah, it was. I mean, there's so many stories, really, but if I think about, I think what I really remember is just how electric they sounded. I think they were really hot live by then, and I think because of the sort of Rough Trade connection, it felt really just like this sort of traveling review or something, like the thing Bob Dylan used to do or something, where you've got this kind of collection of people just traveling around. And there was that kind of hiatus, but then it was really lovely at the end of that summer of 2001 that we did do these extra shows, because it was almost like, oh, we get to do it again, and I had about 5 of my mates come on my tour bus, and they all got to know the Strokes really well. They were just very inclusive, um, and then what happened was, so by the next year, I was doing my first New York shows. So I then played 3 nights in New York, and you know, I'd kept in touch with the Strokes, and they they told us where to go, or where to meet them, and it was called the Two A's, sort of Lower East Side Manhattan. And my wife's a New Yorker, so this was all quite exciting for me anyway, because I was getting to go to where she was from, and I was getting to meet her family, and it was just all very exciting. And I remember going to meet the Strokes in their bar, and then um, it was cool just to be on their turf, and they were like, "What are you guys doing here?" It was like, they were like Mull, because they knew about Mull by then, and I don't know if they could have picked it out on a map, but they knew where we were from and where I was from, and they were like, I mean, did you get the ferry here? They were like, they were kind of like, what are you doing here? And then, I mean, I'd said we were coming, but I don't think they quite believed it. And then, but I did get one up on them after all this Strokes business. They were obviously huge CBGB's fans, and they were kind of definitely doing something different, but they were definitely repurposing some of that exciting, and why not, that kind of amazing late 70s new wave post-punk. Um, and my first night in New York, I went to CBGB's, but then it was just a kind of rock club, and they were throwing people out. It was, but my wife, being a New Yorker, was able to say, look, there's this Scottish guy. It was end of the night, the people they were trying to get people out of the place, but they were like, all right, and you come. So I was able to go in and have a quick look in CBGB's. It was empty, but it was actually quite good because the lights were on, and the graffiti was everywhere. And anyway, so that was cool. But by the time a week later my shows were on, I'd gone a week early, and the Strokes were like, yeah, we're going to come. And guess who turned up to my first New York show? Um, just to impress them, I think, David Byrne, Talking Heads.
Wow. Okay.
So, and I was a huge, I mean, I literally had a kind of ghetto blaster on Tom Morris, and Mull as a kid, listening to Road to Nowhere and all that, Once in a Lifetime, all that stuff. So I was a huge David Byrne, who's also Scottish, he was born in Glasgow. So I don't know if he thought it was the real Mull Historical Society and there was some kind of historical talk. I don't know what it was, but no, I did talk to him, and he said, well, I've read about it. And I remember him saying, I was on the website, and it was really loud. This was before I played actually in the club. So my PR had got me to meet him, which was really, so I knew he was in the room, And I was so busy thinking, are the Strokes here? Do they know he's here? And I said, no, what were you on? And he goes, no, I was on, and I turned, he's on, and I was on your website. I was on your, and I saw you were, and I think he'd probably, he was probably quite a student of what's happening. He'd probably read it in NME or something, and he came with his wife. I remember. So, um, so yeah, there was quite a few reasons why I suppose New York and that culture, personal reasons, but also, just being around those bands. It was, and I was always fascinated with New York, and even as a kid, watching anything about New York and hip hop and things like that. So yeah, it was just more kind of child and sweetie shop stuff, But yeah, it was. Sorry, I've probably never talked so much about that tour, but it was. I
Enjoying it,
suppose
yeah.
that's the name of the game here, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And did the Strokes see? Were they aware that David Byrne was there?
I don't know. I don't really remember. I think he might have come a different night because it was a 3 night thing. And I should say I did do my own shows in New York, but it was part of this Scottish, like they have St. Paddy's Day. They were
Right.
trying to do a sort of equivalent in New York, and so it was like a big sort of Scottish government funded push, So, and I suppose I was the kind of new band of Scotland at that time, and I was a lot of coverage, so I was kind of headlining. But there was Scottish comedians, other, like more traditional music, fashion designers. There was so it was in the lower, it was in Manhattan, literally looking out the window of this kind of repurposed, what do you call it? Like, it was almost like an exhibition space, looking at the Statue of Liberty in the distance. I mean, it was, you couldn't have written it, but I think also that probably attracted David Byrne because it was like a Scottish sort of cultural thing, and it was, it was very much a gig. And funnily, the early supporters in the States of my music, maybe I'd been reading some of the British music press, were there, and people I know still come to my gigs. So, it was a gig, but it was a bit of it was quite an exciting sort of cultural kind of collective, and so maybe he was also interested in that. So I think he came the first night. I don't know if they were on the same night. But yeah, over the years, I've had interactions with the Strokes, and I suppose for them it must have been quite a seminal moment how much they were embraced in UK, and with the UK label, and so yeah, I mean, I remember most of it, but there's definitely nights I don't remember.
No, it's cool because you can watch. I mean, me and my mates got obsessed with the In Transit documentary they did around that time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it must be cool, like, to look back on that as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's funny because I remember, like, you think about it, this was kind of early days of sort of blogging and things like that, and I remember Rough Trade because they knew I hadn't, I was, they knew I was interested in literature and writing, and I mean, literally on those tour buses, I started writing my first short stories, and, probably 10, 12 years later, my first novel came out, but they actually asked me, would I write a tour diary? And I did, and I mean, I remember kind of going into internet cafes and, as it was then, and blogging away. I mean, it doesn't really exist. I think at one time, I don't know, 10 years ago or 50, I tried to see if but I don't think it really exists, but anymore. But it was, so I was kind of documenting some of it, and, I'm trying to think of some of the other, we did go all around the UK really. And, but it was just really exciting by that time we'd reached London, I suppose, because it just felt like their kind of reputation was gathering steam, and everywhere you went, you felt there was a real kind of air of anticipation. So it's fun. It was fun to be a part of. I probably got stuff in here. Are we doing this in video as well? Or are you?
Yeah, if that's
Yeah.
cool, yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, there's bound to be stuff around here that probably would, relate to that time. So.
Yeah, I did want to mention that amazing piece of memorabilia you've got with Julian's signature on it.
Oh yeah, yeah. I don't have that in this room, but I've got that. Yeah, I've got. It was really nice. Rough Trade. I think it was towards the end of that year. Yeah, they gave me a kind of signed poster of the "Is This It" cover, and Julian had sort of signed it for me, and so yeah, it's just become a kind of ticket stub holder over the years. But yeah, yeah, it's a nice kind of reminder, and I did. I mean, I then did start touring with other US bands. About a couple of years after that, I toured with REM, and really nice Southern gentlemen. In fact, I've got. Can you see this bottle of wine?
Yeah.
So this was one of the shows at Brixton Academy, and I remember turning up to an empty, sound check, and we walked in, the place is empty, obviously, and we just started watching them sound checking, and they had a big blackboard with about 100 songs on it because it was their best of tour. It was, so Michael Stipe had this kind of blue stuff down his face, and he just stopped the sound check, and he went, "Are you guys Mull?" He just called us Mull, and I went, yeah, and he went, "Hey," and then went back into, whatever it was, and because they were also on Warner, so there was a kind of connection, but. They were just so welcoming and encouraging, but at the end of it, I got this. He came up to me, Michael Stipe, and gave me this bottle of Chateauneuf du Pape, quite an expensive wine, long since drunk, and there's a bit of gaffer tape on it, and he said, "Mull, I wanted to get you Buckfast, but this will have to do. All the best, Michael and REM." I mean, for him even to know what Buckfast was is quite impressive, I thought. But so yeah, so it kind of, I think, I was always like a lot of British Scottish kids. You were really, you were obviously very influenced by a lot of what came from the States. So it was really kind of from the Strokes onwards. I've really enjoyed um, those type of interactions. But and you also learn, you get to watch these bands every night, and it was just exciting to kind of soak some of that up.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about like, you mentioned yourself that you were, focused on making music, kind of the art of it or whatever. Did you get a bit of an insight into the way Julian worked at all on that tour? Or was it mainly just
Um,
like enjoying the tour?
yeah, mainly enjoying the tour, but no, we did talk about sort of songwriting. It's funny. I mean, I was a few years older than them, and I can always remember we got to, I think, the lead mill in Sheffield, um, and they came sort of running in, and there was a feature in Q magazine on me at the time, and I'd had a bit of press leading up to them. Obviously, they were not short of press themselves, but I remember that it had my age on it, and 20, whatever, I can't remember, and they were obviously a few years younger. And I remember them come running up, and they were, "My God, we thought you were younger." Than they were like really, I don't know, a baby face or something. I don't know what, but I can always remember their kind of surprise, and and there was kind of interactions like that. And yeah, we did talk about. I think what I talked to him about, I remember because I mentioned earlier about my sort of songwriting approach, and I kind of hear finished songs in my head. You know, there's lots of things I'm a bit of a jack of all trades with. I'll just pick up an instrument and have a go. But I do feel I can hear a kind of finished song in my head, and um, I didn't really know that about myself. Even as a sort of teenager, I used to kind of hear all the instruments. Sometimes it's a bit of an issue because sometimes you want to leave room for experimentation. You don't want to go into the studio and just say, "All right, I've got it imprinted here. That's what I'm going to do." You have to. So I've learned to kind of work with that. But the reason I mention that is I remember talking to him about that, to Julian Casablancas, and he kind of went, "Yeah, right, right, right," that to me as if I felt a wee bit like you could talk in shortcuts. I think, but I think what was really interesting, and I probably didn't appreciate. I mean, appreciated them, and their music, but maybe didn't realize it so much. But if I think about it now, his songs were almost like little orchestral pieces. I mean, obviously they were not orchestral music, but you know that he did it in a very minimal way. But if you listen to what he was doing with the bass lines, with the guitar lines, with the drum, with the rhythm elements, that maybe Vampire Weekend and things have gone on to, I think, be quite influenced by as well. He was doing it in a very minimal way. I had choir boys, steel drums, harp players, even that these first American shows, because it was very well funded. This thing, I actually had about a nine-piece band. Can you imagine your first show in New York and having a nine-piece band? You know what I mean? So so I was getting to use all these instruments and hearing all that, but he was doing this. He was doing it with two guitars, bass, and drums. And I thought it was really powerful what he could kind of achieve in that way. And I think there wasn't a wasted note. And um, we talk a wee bit about sort of talking about that. But I think more than anything, it was just having fun, being in the moment, and then what's happening, where we're going next, you know, and who the hell's going to turn up next. I mean, this is just like this kind of roadshow.
Yeah, yeah. Yes. Well, obviously, you want to talk about how it panned out from that point. I think
hmm
he did he produce end up producing 5 albums in the 2000s. Like, was it quite a prolific time?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was it? Yeah, one, two, three. Yeah, probably about five. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it was. it was prolific. I think again, it's just I was getting to do it what I wanted to do, and I'd been waiting a while and a few near misses, and so yeah, I was just loving like so I made those first two I mentioned in that studio in Glasgow, and then I went to my third album. It's called This Is Hope, third MHS album, and I made that in upstate New York. So again, sort of New York connection, but this was Woodstock, so where the famous festival had happened. A really quaint, upstate New York little town. And I'd been a big Mercury Rev fan, and they were from Catskills in upstate New York, so I was kind of interested in that. And I made that there. It's called Bearsville Studios. So if anyone looks it up, it was really built off the back of Bob Dylan's sort of empire. Bob Dylan's manager was called Albert Grossman, and he had settled at Bearsville, and Dylan had lived in Woodstock as well. I was driven by one of the studio engineers to where Dylan had lived. The band, the band that Dylan had, so the Big Blue, the Big Pink, I mentioned the Big Blue because my new album's on last night from Glasgow, brilliant label in Glasgow, and they've got a record shop called the Big Blue in Glasgow in tribute to the Big Pink. So, but the original Big Pink, I went to their house. I went to the house where the band and where Dylan made the basement tapes. But that was only 5 minutes drive from Bearsville Studios at Woodstock. So, the Woodstock town was kind of built off the back of Albert Grossman and the people, the bands that he managed. Janis Joplin. So here was me coming in sort of 2005, and it was a bit tired, to be honest. Albert Grossman had passed, and there was a few studios there, and I was staying there. So it was a bit Twin Peaks, to be honest. I was kind of there, and the engineer would kind of go home at night. He lived in a neighbouring town, so I was kind of there on my own. And there was all these wild flying turkeys going around, and but he was telling me how on some of the trees there was still the initials of Dylan and the band etched and stuff like that. And I got to make it in this Turtle Creek barn and Turtle Creek studio, where they'd recorded, and I got to produce it again. So it was really exciting. Really, it was. I remember the engineer took me to one of the lockups, and there was a Mini in there, and he said, "That's Janis Joplin's Mini." This was 30 plus years after she'd obviously passed, but and the funniest thing was, it was a bit on its last legs. I think it's now closed, but their plumbing wasn't really working, and I was well looked after, but they would take me to their other houses in the town, they owned other places to go and shower and stuff. And my uncles, as I mentioned at the beginning, were the plumbers in Mull. So I couldn't help thinking I needed my uncles more than ever, as musicians, but also plumbers. And because everything was breaking down around me. And there was one point, they had this beautiful big desk that, loads of albums, like Woodface, Crowded House had been made on this desk. And, it was quite a lot of history still there. And so they were running a desk, but also, Pro Tools or digital. But one of the big attractions of Bearsville was they had these amazing old desks, Neve desks. And but, you could save the Pro Tools, but it was a longer process to save it, and I was getting a bit nervous because it was a song called This Is the Hebrides on that album, and it's very intricate. I'd been to New Orleans a few months earlier, recording all these found sounds that were going to go into the album. It was definitely a US influenced album, and they hadn't saved the desk, and there was a power cut. Everything was happening in this place, and so I lost the mix. And there was lots of sort of things there that, it was the middle of the winter, that was kind of a bit, yeah, it was a bit kind of spooky, and but it was just special to have that history around. And he was quite an old school mixer, a guy who was there, and he said to me, I was devastated by this mix being lost. And he'd said, he was so cool, he was so chilled. He was like smoking away. He was like, "We'll get it in the morning, we'll get it tomorrow, and it'll be better." And we did. And I trusted it was better, but I kind of couldn't think anything different, otherwise. Um, so yeah, that was an album I made in that kind of 2000s. And then I made an album with Nick Franklin, who was a producer, musician in a band called Lemon Jelly.
Oh
Don't you
yeah.
remember Lemon Jelly were kind of Mercury nominated as well, weren't they? And I made that. He produced that, so I learnt a lot from him. Nick was very creative and would pull vinyl off the shelf, like Peter comedy records, and make it into a backing track. He just was very creative with rhythm and being a kind of dance DJ, and so that was a bit more of a programmed element as well. That album had a few guest spots. I had Tony Benn, who was a kind of prominent Labour politician, did a kind of voiceover piece on it. Yeah, and then a couple of other albums through the kind of noughties period.
And how did it work out with Rough Trade and stuff like that?
It kind of worked out in that I'm still, in touch with Jeff and everything's fine. I mean, basically, it was funny meeting the Mystery Jets of so recently because they kind of went in reverse. They I think signed with Warner's and then to Rough Trade. I went the other direction. Um, it sort of came to a natural point where then I was on Warner's and probably had a bit less of a kind of the influence of Jeff, but he was just one of these people who's got such great ears, and such a great sensibility. You could even now, I could ask him, you could probably drop him a line, ask him a question or his advice on anything. And but I then kind of morphed off Warner's to a label called Be Unique, who a very similar sort of story with the Jeff playing me the kind of CDR as it was of the Strokes early, before it was released. I remember going to Be Unique and they gave me a load of things they were signing. This was in London. I was taking the bus and leaving, and one was the Kaiser Chiefs. And
All right.
I remember kind of listening to it and thinking, this sounds, I couldn't quite place it, and so that's who was kind of label mates for a while there. And then I've yeah, so that was kind of moving off Rough Trade, and I've been released by Extra Mile Recordings, who have got kind of Frank Turner, and they're great people, long time there. And then now Last Night from Glasgow. So yeah, I've sort of found a home, and hopefully the right people wherever I've kind of gravitated to. But yeah, definitely felt an exciting era to um, to kind of be a part of. And I think because it was the period you were talking about, and that you look at here, Harry, was that kind of post Britpop. You couldn't fail to be influenced by some of those bands, as I've talked about already. And I remember playing a joint headline tour with the Polyphonic Spree. I don't know if you've heard anybody talking about the Polyphonic Spree,
Yeah, I have
but
now and again, yeah, but like quite an incredible amount
17
of
of them.
members.
Yeah, but 17 quite sort of almost evangelistic, sort of white cloaks from Texas. I can't imagine their tour support. I don't know who paid for them to go on tour, but they were really exciting live. Watching them every night was really exciting, and there was something almost a bit kind of Ziggy Bowie. I mean, I didn't witness Ziggy Bowie's tour, but that kind of, it was quite raw and but very melodic, and obviously loads of them on stage. And I remember finishing at Brixton Academy on the Forum, and for our encore, a Small Historical Society, we wore the gowns, and the closest I ever got to being a choir boy, I think. But and I remember going. I was staying in London at the time, and leaving, and I was exhausted. I was a long tour, and I was making the second one of the albums at the time as well. I was just juggling, and my manager called and said, "Where are you?" And I said, "Oh, I'm on the other side of London. It was about nearly midnight or something." He goes, "Oh well, we've got Noel Gallagher and whatever the Oasis band members well of that time here, and wondering where the fucking singer is." and and so yeah, I was like, oh, do I try and get back there? But yeah, sliding doors. Uh, but all my kind of band and crew and stuff that were just really nice and funny and chatting about football and taking the piss out of who supported Rangers or Celtic or and apparently he said when he walked in, he goes, "Where's the guy?" I think he said the singer, and I think they said, "Oh, he's gone," and he said, "It's something like typical fucking singer, takes all the acclaim and fucks off." I wonder who he was talking about. So yeah, there's been a few kind of those type of quite, but I suppose it was nice. It was nice to think, oh well, people that had influenced me were then. Even if I missed that moment, but it was quite nice. And I've come across Liam a few times, but I remember it's funny. I never even think about this stuff, let alone sit talking about it. But it's quite interesting, Harry. You've taken me right back to a period, and because I was on my own a lot, with not, I had a great touring band, but I remember, if it was promo or that, sometimes I would be on tour. I remember once going down to London for the day for the Q Awards. So I was kind of just like a fly in the wall. I wasn't nominated or anything, but I was there, and I was sitting with different bands, but I didn't know. I don't remember. I think I sort of went along maybe on my own. Maybe my manager couldn't come or something. Anyway. And I remember going to the toilet and Liam Gallagher walks in. And so and he's all right, and just chatting away. And this was about 2001, so it was, post Blur and Oasis battles, but it was still within, not that long ago. But and I remember going out and we had a little chat, and then I can't remember. I think he was like, "Oh, yeah, I think I read about you in Enemy or something like that." I was like, "Oh, this is quite nice." And I said, "Well, we just said I was, just chatting anyway, just leaving, went and wherever I went and sat down and I watched and I saw Damon Albarn walking in, and then I saw him looking and mouthing, "Liam's here," and just he was on his own and just kind of having a little smile, thinking of what's going to happen, And I mean, it wasn't quite mid-90s, this was a few years later, but it was I remember just being a bit of a witness to things like this, and so I was sitting there and thinking, I don't nothing. I don't even think I saw them in their own company, same company, but there was definitely quite a few people in that sort of noughties period for me that it was quite nice to suddenly find yourself in amongst this kind of world, or being witness to some of the people who had sort of come just ahead of me, and who had obviously influenced some of what I was doing.
No, yeah, definitely, yeah. And then you mentioned the writing. Where did that kind of fit into things?
Yeah, so as I said, just started kind of writing on tour, and started off trying to kind of write short stories, and I remember thinking, "Oh, this feels like it comes from the same place." I felt like it was something authentic about it, and I definitely, because I'd been writing songs since I was 6, 7 years old, and I mentioned my uncles, and by the period that my music was out there and I was releasing and touring, and I would like to think, I knew how to write a song. You're always learning, but it was something I was sort of that was instinctively doing. But I remember thinking I had to kind of learn the craft of writing, and just anything that was on the Booker list, or like I'd want to watch, I would just get that book and I would buy all the books and I would read a lot on tour. And I was kind of just self-educating, really. I was just learning what I loved and trying to figure out how you did it. And yeah, so that just became another passion and something I wanted to do. And then um, 2015, my debut novel came out. It's called The Letters of Ivor Punch. And um, Ivor Punch is a retired police sergeant of an unnamed island. I felt I had enough Mullness. It is Mull, but I just called it, I like calling it the island, just sort of removing the layers a bit. And it travels around different historical eras and periods. Um, but it definitely has a kind of theme of islands and loss. I mean, my debut album was Loss, so it's definitely been a theme that's sort of run through my work. Um, and then I was asked to adapt that novel for the stage. I thought, I've never written a play in my life, but I suppose that you try and learn quickly with good people around you. And that was staged in Glasgow and Edinburgh, and Ivor was a kind of slightly younger man in the stage telling. So I just had a little light bulb in my own creative world, for me, when I kind of learned to trust those moments. And I thought, I like crime fiction. So I thought, how about I felt I could just shake this guy's hand. I felt, well, I haven't written him for a while, but I've just sort of got returned, and seeing him on stage, the stage adaptation, I decided to give Ivor his own sort of standalone series. So in the last 2 years, 2 years ago, I had my first it's called the Mull Mysteries. So it's a crime series with Ivor Punch as the sergeant of the island. And it's no longer the island, it's Mull. I like then removing all those layers. And the second in that series is called An Island Burning, and it looks a bit like this for those watching. And that's just come out. So that came out last month, and the new Mull Historical Society album is In My Mind There's a Photograph, and that comes out in May, end of this month. So yeah, it's felt like quite a lot going on at once, but to me they're all kind of connected, and the thing that's brought everything together is this album series that I'm doing in collaboration with authors. As I mentioned, I'm kind of playing Elton to their Bernie. So I've got the first of those was 2023. It was In My Mind There's a Room. And I got to go back to my grandfather's room on Mull where he wrote his poetry, because it's been turned into a recording studio by a mate, Gordon, back home, which was never imagined would ever happen. The room, the place I kind of spent a lot of my childhood is now a recording studio. And I got, there's a drum kit in my grandparents' bedroom. And so I thought, if I'm going to get the chance to go back home and record in this significant room, I thought I'd ask some of my favourite authors for original words on a significant room to them that I would then morph into song, because I'd never really collaborated like that, the way I imagine Elton does. And so that album was made back home, and we finished it at Abbey Road, so I got to start it on Mull and finish it in another significant room to me, and to master it there. So that had Ian Rankin, Val McDermid, Nick Hornby, Sebastian Barry, who's an Irish author, kind of Booker winner, who I love. So that was a real great experience. And the new album is the second of those, and it's now In My Mind's a Photograph. So it's a new kind of list of 12 authors that I'm collaborating with. This time, they're not picking a room, it's a significant photo. And I've got Irvine Welsh is the new single. It's called Dopamine Eyes. And for those who want to have a look, mullhistoricalsociety.com, you'll see the images, the photos that the authors have picked. And then Irvine's is the first time he met his now wife, and it was in lockdown, and they met for a socially distanced walk. So this photo is actually he and his wife with the masks on the first time they'd met. So yeah, it's been just another way to collaborate. And maybe you asked about my writing, Harry. I also have a memoir that came out a few years ago, which Um, I'll send you a copy, but it's called Hometown Tales: The Boy in the Bubble, and that very much talks about growing up in the Hebrides, the islands, the local characters, the folklore, a lot of which has gone into my music and now the books. But I also touch on it also leads up to this period you're talking about, the kind of early noughties and getting a record deal, first shows, first touring, strokes, all that kind of stuff. So I suppose that might be something to point people towards if they're looking to kind of get a sense of my world in that period.
Yeah, yeah. That's a really interesting way of writing music. Like how, don't know, do you find it easy to write with other people's ideas, or how do you find
Um,
it?
well, it's been, I think it's felt very natural. I think when even hearing myself say it to you earlier, just talking about it there, it sounds very sort of conceptual, like, but actually they're just songs, I mean, actually, when I was making them, the first album in the series, In My Mind's a Room, um, they just felt like my words. And to be honest, you know, like I titled a lot of the songs. Some of them I remember Nick Hornby's, um, his his song is about he as a sort of teenager growing up, and his older sister, had this kind of bedroom above him, and she would have maybe, a boyfriend come into the door, and in the summer, he and his mates would sit on the flat roof of the garage, which led to his bedroom window, but could be a shortcut into the house, and they'd be smoking cigarettes, um, and his lyrics were things like, it was, maybe about 25 lines saying we were cocky little shits and things like that. And I mean, I've never had cocky little shits as a lyric, but it was like, okay, what do I do with this? But it wasn't titled. But just towards the end, as a novelist, he'd done this beautiful kind of symmetry with he and his mates and these kind of potential boyfriends of his older sister arriving, almost like he was talking about the cats coming in and out of the house as well, and they would drag dead birds in. So he was kind of almost kind of contrasting all these things going on in this house and his kind of childhood summers. And at one point he wrote, "The birds had panicked feathers," and I thought, there's the title, So you're always trying to pick a title that's maybe not been used before, or so it has been a real collaboration. Some of the songs I've maybe added words in, I've titled them. Some of them, like Ian Rankin, the kind of famous crime novelist, Ian's words were very formed. You could almost see the song because he's a huge music fan. He was in bands as a teenage, as a student and stuff. Um, it's just kind of felt like a continuation of the songs I write anyway. You know what I mean? But definitely they've taken me. The new album has taken me around the world. There's a Chinese American Pulitzer Prize winner, Yiyun Lee, who her song is a picture of her and her friends as teenagers in a Chinese accordion band. And she says, we thought we were like a youth orchestra. We expected to have orchestra, but all we got was a load of accordions. And she, as an adult, stumbled on this photo, didn't even know she still had it. I think a friend, who was in the band had discovered it, and she's now in America, and that's where her life is. But she sent these amazing lyrics about being in kind of state-run China, and now as an adult looking, and what she remembered as blue skies were kind of grey skies, and there was guards around, and it's a kind of slightly different perspective after all these years. So her and she talks about how there was a lake there, and we called it a lake, but she says as an adult it just looks like a pond. That kind of shifting sort of perspective. So the song's we called it a lake. So yeah, there's subject matter and places that the songs have taken me that I just wouldn't have happened otherwise. It's been a real kind of privilege to enter their frames, if you like, and to actually have the photos to work with as well.
Yeah, and there's a bit of a link to Hull, where I'm originally from, with Alan Johnson.
Oh
That was
yeah, so
interesting.
that's great. Yeah, so Alan Johnson, who some of your viewers and listeners will know, kind of I think the best prime minister we never had, to be honest. Kind of Labour um, cabinet minister, and um, I was aware that Alan was kind of into my music, and I think he'd mentioned it in a press piece, and I kind of admired him from afar. He's a politician I always thought was very relatable, and just whenever you'd see him come on, and turns out he was in a band in the '60s, and he now writes great books, and his memoirs. I don't know if you've read them, but if you're
No,
from
no.
Hull, well, I really recommend. And they all have Beatles titles, so it's This Boy, Hey Mr. Postman, because he became, he was a postman, and so he's very relatable. And he actually came back to Mull with me, up to Mull to do a book event, and we're doing an event in London at the end of the year, actually, at the St Andrew's Day Book Festival. Um, Alan's song is called "The Soldier and the Waitress," and his picture, which again, if you go on this Mull Historical's website, you'll see all the pictures. His is of his parents' wedding day, and he says it was the last happy day they had. And it's quite powerful. His words. It's his kind of recollection as a kid growing up in Ladbroke Grove, Notting Hill, not the Notting Hill of the film. He grew up in quite a poverty-stricken area, but with an amazing sister who, if you read his memoir, the first one is This Boy. It won many awards. Highly recommended. You just can't put it down. It's so readable but powerful. And that picture is also the first page of that memoir, actually. So he felt, when I got in touch with him, he said, I feel that's immediately, he goes, that's the picture comes to mind. So, and his words were great. And he talks about, again, it's a bit like that kind of child view being an adult now, the kind of looking back on, and his mother died at 41, and his father lived twice as long. His father wasn't in his life really, but he kind of talks about why couldn't she have lived that long? It's quite powerful. And so so it's that was one. It wasn't, some of them I maybe knew some of the authors. I did a soundtrack for a Irvine Welsh TV film some years ago, so I'd sort of collaborated a little bit with Irvine before, but yeah, it felt quite an intimate insight into their worlds, and it was nice to be trusted, really, But I think you have to, when you're doing that, what I've learned is you kind of have to take it on yourself, really, and make your own work out of it. It just. I read about Elton, how he gets Bernie Taupin's lyrics, types them out, or they're probably typed out, sits them on his piano, and who knew, as he said, Tiny Dancer was going to sound the way it did. Who knew Yellow Brick Road? These songs that Bernie Taupin was writing about his own personal life suddenly became these global, universal songs. Rocket Man. All these things. And I'm not claiming to be Elton John by any means, but I've enjoyed trying to be on that journey, with just taking somebody else's words and thinking, I can go anywhere I want with this. What does it speak to me of? What does it sound like? Is it what instrument is it? And when I mentioned earlier about somehow being a bit completist, sometimes hearing everything finished, I think it's been quite good for me because I've had to kind of just start from another place, and not necessarily build things up, but think maybe this is just voice and piano, maybe this is so. But I'm interested with your Hull connection though, Harry, because I was for one night only the Hull Historical Society, and
Right.
I don't know if it's still there, but there was a guy who ran a venue in his house.
Yeah,
Do you know
Paul
of that?
Jackson. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, you
Adelphi.
know it. Adelphi, yeah. So
Yeah.
played there early days, and Yeah, so we were one for one night only. It was amazing. It's amazing to be in the guy's house and then suddenly it's a venue and that was one memory, I never forgot that. It was a great night, and um such a unique experience, to play there.
No, yeah,
It's
Adelphi's
still
legendary.
going.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he died recently.
Oh, shame. All
He's
right.
like a major kind of gathering for his funeral last week, I think, or the
All
couple of
right,
weeks
all
ago.
right. Gosh, all right.
But yeah, it's still
Well,
going. Yeah.
you set up some institution, some legacy there.
No, exactly. Yeah, yeah. All right, mate. Well, the album's out end of this month, and then you're doing like a an evening with in June and September. What can we expect from that?
That's right. So I'm doing first time I've really done this type of show, an evening with Mull Historical Society. So I'm doing because I've got the novel out at the same time as the album. It's quite a nice way to bring them both together. So I'm doing um, yeah, readings, but also songs. I'm taking requests, Q&A. Um, so it's a gig, but it's a kind of gig where you can shout out a request. Hopefully not a Strokes song. Hopefully there'll be one of mine. Um, but after all this strokeness, but yeah. So I'm playing across the UK. As I said, I'm playing London June the 4th, St Pancras Old Church. So I'm playing kind of across the UK, going back to Mull, and then kind of Glasgow, Edinburgh, and Stirling, and kind of early June. And then in September, I'm playing across the kind of English dates. So London early June, 4th of June, but then I'm playing September um, across the UK. So yeah, it's also quite timely that we're having this conversation, Harry, on my end anyway, because it's 25 years since some of this period we were first talking about. My kind of debut album, Lost, came out, and first touring and all that stuff. So I'm going to be doing a bit more later in the year, or maybe early next year, to kind of play Lost in its entirety with some of the new stuff as well. So that's to come. But this year will be quite fun just to yeah play some songs from Lost from the catalogue really, as well as new stuff. So yeah, will I say where I'm going? I'm going to September 11th, Hebden Bridge, Birmingham 16th, 15th, Reading 16th. I believe you're in Manchester.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I'll come down. Yeah,
cool, come along. 17th, St Michael's, and then Cambridge, Southampton, Bristol in September. So yeah, stories, songs, and kind of readings. Yeah, so these are coming up.
cool. And then I also saw it's 25 years since you played Jules Holland. I was interested in what that experience was like.
Yeah, yeah, that was great. Played Jules Holland. God, got it somewhere here. Um, talking of that era, um, I'm coming back. Don't worry. Um, so, oh, actually, there's a. Oh yeah, Reading and Leeds,
Oh yeah.
MHS somewhere on there, and the Strokes. So yeah, there's a few things have come out of the boxes. This is Jules Holland show.
Ah, okay, cool.
Can you see that? So yeah, I had Dave Gilmour, Pink Floyd. Jules was on with his big band, so it was one of those ones. So he had his band on. Paul Carrick, he had a song, big song, The Wonder Years, and then Suggs, Madness,
Oh yeah.
and Tim Burgess, Charlatans were on as well. Um, so yeah, it was yeah, fun times. We kind of dressed the stage up a bit because coming from the Hebrides, I think I started this on that Strokes tour. People started bringing inflatable sheep to the gigs. You know what they say about us Celts, So, um, so I think we just had a load of them, and we just kind of dressed up. And so I remember Jules Holland holding one of them as he kind of introduced us. So Um, so, but yeah, that was fun. And again, it was just kind of everything happening at once a little bit, but it was great to kind of have, still great, all the experiences you have. And also just sometimes when you get to see how other bands work close up as well.
No, yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay,
And
mate. Well, go on. Sorry. Yeah.
to go completely full circle, Dave Gilmore used to fly to Mull. They used to have a light air show that we'd go to as kids.
Right.
And so I remember I was too young to really know who he was, but I remembered all the older, teenagers running around with an autograph book for him. I think I did get his autograph, so I never realised I was going to be in Jules Holland with him all these years later.
Did you
Um,
mention that to him?
I think I might have done. I don't really have a memory of it. I don't know if I did. I don't know if it was just one of these early memories, but it was a strange thing because we're going off piste a bit, but you would be a kid going to this light aircraft show and suddenly you get taken up by somebody and you'd be flying over your house, and I'm sure I never was in his one, I don't think, but yeah, so it was, I don't remember if I did mention it, but I suppose if you look for it, there's some connection everywhere.
Yeah, that says. All right, mate. Well, appreciate your time. Just finished on a couple that I always ask guests.
Okay.
What was the highlight of the early days, and is there anything that you do differently?
Um, God, highlight. Well, I've talked of, people that inspire you and meeting certain people, and these were special moments, but I think probably the highlight was, um, just first album coming out, and um, through that summer of sort of that year of 2001, and then really just getting to make more records, getting to really do what you dreamt of doing as a kid. I mean, that really was for me kind of highlight. I think that's what I look back and think. Had that not happened, um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what else I would. I think it was it was really getting to make the music that you had kind of going on in your head, and as a kid growing up in a bit of an outpost, um, I was obsessed with trying to, you know, trying to record music and be a musician, and Abbey Road and places just seemed like, you know, I don't know, just these kind of places that were just so out of reach and special, and to actually be able to kind of have some of those experiences as part of my journey, that's been the most special thing, and first seeing Loss in the sort of shops, and hearing stuff getting played, and hopefully people, seem to appreciate the music. That was just, that whole period was really special for that.
Yeah, yeah. And is there anything you would do differently about your
Oh,
career?
sorry. Yeah. Would I do differently? Um, I mean, I really honestly believe that it's just a journey you're on. And I'm not trying to sound too, I mean more just even a creative journey. I think for me, I just keep trying to find other ways to be creative, and um, it's been great to also be an author and to then bring some of that back into my music area. What would I do differently? I mean, um, I think I've learned this a bit more subsequently, but to be in the moment a bit more, you know. I think my eye was always on what's next. I think it is a bit now. I mean, it's really weird that I've spent an hour talking about all this because I think, I don't know, it's just my disposition, I think probably there was times like I remember playing Shepherd's Bush Empire for the first time, and really only a year earlier I'd been playing Dublin Castle and places in London, or quite small places, and then suddenly it was all. And I remember sort of, I think I probably, I think I would, if I would do something different, I would try and just be in the moment a bit more, and just really appreciate being on those stages. And but maybe you can't have it all. I think the fact that I was quite prolific and hopefully have continued to be meant I was probably always thinking about what am I doing next, or trying to juggle. I've got a memory of being on that Strokes tour and phoning my answer phone back in Glasgow. I mean, we did have our mobile phone then, it wasn't like the Flintstones, but I don't know why. Maybe I just didn't have something with me and going into a payphone and phoning my answer phone to leave a melody message for the album. So there was always too many hats being worn at times, and maybe I would say I've tried to kind of appreciate a bit more.
Yeah, yeah. You caught out a bit of the last bit, but just appreciate a bit more.
Trying to appreciate moments a bit more. Yeah, I think that's
Yeah,
something I've tried to learn along the way. And if I could say that to myself, then I might have said, "Well, that's all very well and good, but I'm trying to make an album here and be on tour, and I'm trying to write a novel, and so yeah." But I think that's something I would that I've tried to learn to do a bit differently.
yeah, yeah. Be cool to hear that answer message. Be a great way of starting a song, wouldn't it? Very retro way of
Yeah, I
starting.
know exactly the melody. I know where it was. It was like a da 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 da, and it's on the song called "Instead" on Loss, and it's a flute that does it. And I think because I was on tour, and it would have been that Strokes tour. I remember it was in Bristol. I remember because I was playing the songs live but hadn't finished the album, so you were getting new idea. I was trying out things differently live. I didn't have a flute on that tour, or a flautist, but I think I was probably thinking I was trying to just put somewhere where I would come back off tour and just gather it all and make sense of it.
Yeah, yeah.
Can't
Oh, that's
remember what I did yesterday, but I can remember that melody.
it.